God bless America. I want to share with you a couple of books that I've just finished reading. The American Miracle and God's Hand on America, both by Michael Medved. I'm putting those two books together because they go together. It's basically... let me tell you a little bit about them and maybe encourage you to read them, because I recommend both of these books. They kind of trace through American history, very selective, and I'll talk about that selection process in a moment. But the first book, The American Miracle, begins with the Puritans, the Mayflower, and goes up to the assassination of Lincoln. And then the second book, God's Hand on America, picks up basically the same theme, same argument that he's making, and goes from the war up until recently. I think the books came out a couple of years ago, I guess. But two very interesting books. Now, when I say tracing the history of America, it's not just a straight-up history. It's very selective. And really, there's no such thing as just straight-up history, in my opinion. If you've ever studied historiography, historiography is the study of history. Well, not the study of the events, but the study of history writing and history making. And so, if you understand historiography, all history writing is selective. You can't say everything, and everybody has a bias and a worldview, and so he just flatly says, "This is what I'm doing. This is my case. This is my argument," and it's very interesting. He comes at it from a viewpoint of American exceptionalism. And so if you stand there and with American exceptionalism, you'll enjoy these two books. If you reject American exceptionalism, I would encourage you to read the book. You might learn something. But it's not even just American exceptionalism that he's trying to make a case for, but God's hand of providence on the development of of America, taking it from the beginning to what it is today. He kind of paints a picture in one of the chapters. I think it might be the final chapter of the first book, or somewhere along the lines of, if aliens came in from another planet and kind of saw politically what is going on around the world 500 years ago, and then come to today, there'd be a lot of similarities all in different continents and different places around the world. Empires have come and gone and everything else, but some similarities. But he said America would have been totally different, from 500 years ago, before the European settlers and as it expanded. And so what he does is he takes these things, and when I say providences, basically what many people would call coincidences in things, and he connects them together and says, this is really an evidence of the hand of God pushing America forward in a particular place, and so for example, let me give you some examples, maybe whet your appetite for the book. One of the things he talks about is the gold rush, the discovery of gold in California. He said it took place shortly after the West Coast there was acquired by the United States. He said if gold would have been discovered before then, it would have been much harder to acquire that for the United States. You see, and so he kind of paints those pictures and explains some of those kinds of things. One of the most fascinating stories I'll share with you is about William Seward. William Seward was the Secretary of State under Lincoln. And here's one of the things about the book is most of the stories are somewhat familiar to those who, if you're familiar with American history, you're going to be familiar with the names and places and things. And he kind of goes along with, especially the expansion of geographical territory. And so the colonies, and then as they expanded, then Louisiana Purchase, the War of 1812, and Andrew Jackson, and all that, and Sam Houston, and Texas, and so those are some of the key junctures. But William Seward, when Lincoln, most people know that Lincoln was assassinated, but a lot of people don't realize that it was part of a conspiracy, not only to assassinate Lincoln, but also the Vice President and Secretary of State. And those were all supposed to happen simultaneously. I mean, it was, like terrorism, modern day terrorism almost. But Lincoln, the assassination of Lincoln, of course, was successful. The assassination of the vice president didn't work out. I think the guy chickened out or something. I can't remember. He didn't do it. But the guy that was supposed to kill the Secretary of State, assassinate the Secretary of State, William Seward, his plan, he came to the door, knocked on the door, came in as a guest, and once in, he rushed into Seward's room and pulled out a knife to slice his throat. He didn't want to shoot him because it didn't want the gunfire to alarm the neighbors, notify the neighbors, and so he went to slice his throat. And he was unsuccessful because William Seward, coincidentally, or as Medford argues, providentially, had a neck brace on, a metal neck brace, because he had been in a carriage accident just a few days earlier. And so this simple carriage accident required him to have a metal neck brace. And so when the would-be assassin came in to slice his throat, he was unsuccessful in killing the guy. And so we would say that's very providential, especially for Seward. But what Medford does is then traces it out and brings in several years later, Seward is the one that brokered the deal to buy Alaska. Nobody else wanted to buy Alaska, and he was kind of going out on his own to purchase Alaska. I mean, who would want Alaska? It's a frozen wasteland up there, unless you're Sarah Palin, I guess. Nobody really cared then, but he was sort of a visionary, and he stepped out. It was very politically incorrect for him to do this, but he did. And what Medford does is fast forward to the Cold War, for example. During the Cold War, think about it, if Russia would still had Alaska, they would have been able to place ballistic missiles within firing range of the continental United States. The Cold War would have turned out very differently if it wasn't for that carriage accident in the mid-1800s that Seward would have had that neck brace. He would have died. Nobody would have wanted Alaska. So you see what I'm saying? He's connecting all these dots, and it makes it very interesting. And speaking of Seward, he's also the one that acquired Midway, the islands way out in the Pacific. I think he wanted it for scientific research or something like that at the time. But come World War II, Midway became, if you're familiar with World War II history, Midway became very instrumental in World War II. And so World War II would have been very different if it wasn't for that carriage accident. And so these two books are chock full of stories like that. And he's saying, you might be able to dismiss one coincidence or two coincidences, but he collects, each one of these books is a little over 400 pages, so almost 900 pages of these stories that he strings together, showing God's hand of providence over America. And so very interesting story. I would highly recommend it. And by the way, he deals... Did I say this already? Every chapter kind of stands alone. So I read through it in a few weeks, I guess. Just work my way through every morning, get up and read a chapter or two. But you can each chapter kind of stands alone, especially the first chapter and the last chapter of each of the books, where he sort of brings in different stories and kind of out of time frame and puts it together to explain what he's trying to do, what he's trying to accomplish, what is this he's trying to convince us of. And so it's very, very, very interesting. And one of the things I was about to say is that I thought was refreshing, that he does not deal with a lot of the negative things. And that's really a big trend today. It's a trendy thing to do, is go in history of America to look at, the worst of the worst and focus on that, the racism or the displacement of the Native Americans and focus on, on the negative, America's bad. Well, he doesn't even talk about those things, which I'm sure, I hadn't read other book reviews, I'm sure that he's highly criticized for leaving those things out. I thought it was refreshing. To be this optimistic and focus on those positive things. And so if you enjoy history, you'll enjoy reading these stories. He brings in a lot of the details that I said, that you might be familiar with Sam Houston, for example, but he brings in a lot of details that I'd never heard before. And I mean, I'm not a strong history buff, American history buff, but I enjoy American history and I kind of know the general flow of it. But he brings in a lot of these details that were extremely interesting, and I enjoy reading. I wanted to share it with you. I'll put links in the description to the books, both of those books, where you can get them on Amazon. I'll probably also link in the description interview by Al Mohler, Dr. Mohler, president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, not long ago interviewed Michael Medved and talked about these two books, and that was a fascinating interview, and actually that's what got me to read the two books. And so I'll put a link in that description as well. I hope you enjoy reading these as much as I did. And so God bless you, and God bless America.